What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some first impressions for Zero Parades for Dead Spies. A certainly contentious upcoming title thanks to some background information I'll get into in just a moment, but you may be a little confused by this video because I am in fact putting up this first impressions roughly 10 or 11 days before the game actually launches. That is, of course, possible because I was given a review key for it, and in this particular case, that review key came with a bunch of, honestly, confusing embargoes. There are several of them. Right now, people are free to post more or less previews or first impressions videos like this. They're going to let people stream it a couple days next week up to a certain point in the game. And then the actual review embargo is on May 18th, which is when you can expect the review. But that's kind of why this video is a little out of the ordinary in that sense. But if I'm being perfectly honest, my interest in this game has pretty much always simply been morbid curiosity, because if you know anything about it, chances are what you know is that this is the next game from the company that worked on Disco Elysium. And I say it that way because there was a big blow up between some of the people who worked there, the company itself, with plenty of bad blood and animosity, though if I am being completely honest, I have not kept up with the nitty-gritty of all that. My general understanding of it is simply that there was a large disagreement between some of the key creatives with the management there that ultimately wound up seeing those creatives forced out, more or less. So obviously the situation is messy, to say the very least, and admittedly that makes me especially curious to see whether or not this game winds up being any good. And while I had played the demo a couple of months ago, with this first impressions, I was able to take that up to the cutoff point ahead of the actual review embargo on the 18th anyway. So let's talk a little bit about exactly that. To hit a sort of top line here, I would say that everything I've seen from this game so far makes it feel like this is a perfectly fine to good narrative title that is simply going to be tainted by its association with Disco Elysium because it simply does not live up to that title. And with all the other drama surrounding it, that's going to be an easy vector of attack for people. So, taken in and of itself and on its own merit, this game seems perfectly good. It has some mechanics I don't love, but at the same time, it's clearly not Disco Elysium in terms of, I would say, the quality of the writing for sure. And even some of the mechanics I don't think necessarily gel super well. And that's a little bit of what I want to get into over the course of this video. But first, let's talk a little bit about how this was running. So obviously this game is set to release. Is there any bugs, etc. that are noteworthy? And the answer there is yes. Some of that is known. They pretty much said in the informational one-pager they sent over that a good chunk of the audio is still being finalized. I also noticed that on certain transitions from loading zones, the game could just freeze up on you, forcing you to like Alt F4 and reload, though luckily the game auto-saves very often so you don't lose progress when that happens. So mostly those two things, audio and then the occasional issue with more or less a soft lock. It's possible some of that will be fixed with the day one patch, but obviously won't change my experience very much. So there is that, I suppose. Now, if you've never actually heard about this game or haven't been following it, what is it? Well, it is a narrative RPG centered around a former spy who was brought back from being on ice, more or less. Several years ago, you had a bit of a falling out with your, let's say, handlers, the people in charge of the spy operations you get up to, after some things went sideways. You wake up, just kind of coming to, only to have to figure out what is going on because the person who was supposed to be working with you is themselves out of commission following an interaction with some strange CD you find in the room. And then you go on to find out that more or less someone from your old life asked for you by name, and thus your information operation was forced to bring you specifically back from your, let's say, vacation, if you will. And what you choose to do with that opportunity as you unravel the secrets of what is going on here exactly is of course up to you, which is where everything is going to change and we get into the narrative options, etc. Now, before I talk too much about progression and everything, which I do want to talk about, I want to highlight the thing that kind of irks me the most about this, and it's actually the way this compares to what Disco Elysium did. So Disco Elysium had this great way of making failure really interesting. You wouldn't necessarily succeed every roll, but sometimes what happened when you failed that roll was more interesting than what would have happened if you succeeded on it, and that made a lot of those interactions worth experiencing. Zero Parades here tries to do that, but I think it falls flat not because of the decisions themselves, though to be clear I don't find them as engaging as Disco Elysium's. I actually think it fails for a slightly different reason. And that is because you don't ever die when your anxiety, fatigue, or delirium go up. So when you fail checks or you pick certain dialogue options, etc., one of those 3 status effects can go up. When it reaches maximum, you don't instantly lose or anything, but rather you have to pick one of your skills associated with that status ailment to just decrease. That is to say, lowering it by a skill point. So you do seem to get a lot of skill points, but it creates this issue where not only when you are failing in this game to succeed on rolls and stuff, there isn't typically a thing that will really grab you attention-wise just based on what is happening in the narrative, but you also potentially get punished a second time by losing a skill here. And that's a little different from Disco Elysium, where if, the things didn't go your way, you might just die in a hilarious situation, and then you reload and try again, which could be annoying on its own, but it was different in a way that was a little less punishing in an interesting way, especially because here, the only time your character ever seems to die is if you fail a specific roll. And that means that not only did you fail because you failed a roll, which then could potentially lead you to being punished in the sense that you might just straight up lose a skill point if it happens enough, you also have a situation where the only time those failures are interesting outside of just being the punishment that they are is when you just die from the failed roll, which admittedly gets you into some funny situations, but it does result in a bit of a feedback loop that is much more negative than Disco Elysium's was, and it honestly just doesn't feel as good to play as a result of that. And I think that's probably the main thing I want to get across in this video here, because beyond that, when you fire up a new game, you have the option between a few presets, but basically, if you want to make a custom stat setup, you pick between your physical, charisma, or mental skills, basically. You'll apply a bunch of points to them, and these are really important. The only way to increase your maximum in these skills outside of this is by conditioning. Eventually you'll encounter thoughts and you can condition yourself with them, which increases the potential maximum for these skills outside of the beginning of the game. However, a lot of those conditioned thoughts come with a variety of things in and of themselves you have to watch out for. I will say these conditioned thoughts do have one leg up on Disco Elysium, which is that some of them affect things outside of the normal scope of gameplay. And what I mean by that is that you will occasionally get options that just straight up give you inventory options or change the way you are able to save the game, for instance. There's one called, I think it's Eternal Victim, that gives you a settings menu option if you have it active that just allows you to get extra bonuses to certain types of skill checks, which I thought was an interesting way to approach that system outside of a game that doesn't really deal in difficulty per se. Another interesting gameplay evolution, I guess you could call it, is that you have these sequences where you can kind of pick and choose your way through a situation and roll accordingly based on your own skills and everything. And those so far have had some fun different outcomes based on exactly how you roll, whether you're successful or not, that kind of thing. And it kind of leads to a more variable situation that is a little more high pressure in the way that a spy might be dealing with, for example. And then on top of that, I will say that the city that I believe is called Portofino, something like that, is interesting enough to explore, but again, the narrative and the way it's written is a little more dry and just doesn't grab you the way Disco's does. Which brings me to kind of the sum up for this particular video as first impressions go. My first impression of Zero Parades, at least with the full game here, is simply that it is a perfectly good narrative RPG. However, Disco Elysium, it is not, and I think it has a way of creating a much more negative feedback loop that I think has the potential to sour people's involvement. Combine that with the drama behind the studio, and I think that's probably going to be more than enough for people to write this off. However, I fully admit I am obviously not done playing the game yet. The full review will drop on May 18th. We'll dig into some of these things a little more there, and who knows, it might surprise me, the story might get infinitely more interesting, but if you're looking for a more detailed look at the game once I'm actually finished with it, that would be the time to wait. And while you're at it, you might as well like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.